open up with a great boom in this glitzy IMAX theater with him introducing the conference. Thank you so much, Forrest. As bookends to your talk, there's a group in town here on non-proliferation, and somebody just gotten back from Iraq and is going to give us a little 10-minute talk the last day of the conference. I'm just sort of shoehorning it in with a Vaseline-coated golden shoehorn, and we'll just see an update on sort of what's there and things like that, because it's an extraordinary situation. At dinner the other night with Gloria and a couple of my kids, we, I guess half the dinner conversation we were talking about, well, what can you do? He could have a jar in his bathroom enough anthrax to kill a few million people. Nobody's going to find it. How do you ever find this concentration of death that possibly exists? At least that's my fantasy of it, and that's something that maybe we'll find out more scientifically this Saturday. I actually gave some serious thought after TED8 of coming in this morning looking like Nicholas Negroponte. I was going to get risers on my shoes, actually go on a diet, and dress up. I've never been had like I was last year by my very dear friend, and it was really funny. I was done in by you and my kids, and I keep on watching it over and over again on the CD-ROM. Nicholas.
Well, no little tricks this time, Ricky. But isn't it a relief to not hear him tell you about this being the party he always wanted to have? Okay? People have just paid too much, too long to believe that party line. Okay? Right? I'm going to use my few minutes this time. And as the newcomers should be told, because you probably don't know it, Ricky and I are the only two people who have been to all the TED conferences and spoken at all of them. So I guess I'm a fixture. I'm going to focus on numbers, and particularly 4 of them, partly because I'm a little pissed off at the press and some of the people who make a business of selling numbers to those who want to get into the digital world. And they usually miss. Now, of course, missing means they'll be hired again to give a new number. And I'm going to focus on 4 particular numbers. My favorite, the one I get quoted a lot of having said back in 1990, it was actually the summer of '93, is that there would be 1 billion users on the net in the year 2000. Now, people didn't pay quite enough attention to the remark because I really did say in the year 2000, not by the year 2000, which gives me an extra 12 months, or at least 11.999. And in the world of exponentials, that extra 11.999 months will mean an awful lot. But still today, there are people counting keyboards, counting this, and coming up miserably short. And one of the things they forget, and it's really important for people who are basing entire business plans on the world population, is that in fact the United States is going to be increasingly a smaller and smaller share of it. And that in countries where development is important and happening now because finally the world of aid and the world of sort of, let me call it the World Bank type sort of activities, realize that there are 3 elements to a developing nation, and those 3 are telecommunications and telecommunications and telecommunications. And it's actually being said, and people are investing in it. So you're going to see by sort of the end of the year 2000, that billion number will in fact come true. And if you go out further in time, where these things obviously have to plateau, you're going to find that the language most commonly spoken on the net will, of course, be Chinese, not English. The second number that I'm interested in, which very, very few people talk about is that that billion is going to be dwarfed by another number, somewhere between 10 and 100 billion, of things on the net. Things that range from Barbie dolls to light bulbs to door knobs to just your automobile to all sorts of things. And that's actually quite important because the proliferation of things on the net, it's already estimated that there are upwards of 100,000 cameras connected to the net in one way or another, is going to, again, just change the fabric of the digital world. And everybody in this room, imagine the following product, that somebody will develop. Barbie just introduced, by the way, a $65 camera from Mattel. Take that $65 camera and put in it just a little bit of a cellular telephone device so that you can access it remotely, and some IP addressing hardware. And you now can take this device and Velcro it to something or stick it on the wall, etc., or nail it to a tree. Everybody in this room would buy 50 of those. I mean, you put one across the street from your house. How many times have you come home from a trip and you're taking the last turn as you're getting home and you wonder, is my house there? Okay? Right? You won't have to do that anymore. Okay? And you could sort of, if you've just planted flowers or you have a vegetable garden and so on. So I bet you everybody in this room will have at least 10 of those sorts of things, which will be, again, part of the world of things on the net. So things don't get enough attention, partly because not enough of them have proportionately gotten on the net, but you'll see that accelerate enormously. Now, the third number, which I've become particularly interested in this year because it is grotesquely underestimated, is the amount of electronic commerce that will be around in the year 2000. Now, the most aggressive that I have seen is an estimate of something like $300 billion of electronic commerce. I believe I saw that recently in The Economist. Now, Ira Magaziner, who's done a lot of great things for the United States recently, particularly the movement to make the internet a tax-free zone or duty-free zone, Ira quotes the number, and I believe he gets it from Forrester Research, who are really wrong most of the time. What happens is that Ira's quoting a number of $300 billion of electronic commerce by the year 2002. Now, that is absurd. And let me tell you, just give you two data points as to how absurd that number is. First is that today, Cisco does $3.5 billion of business over the net. Now, let me be honest, the way that number is computed is, and the way they compute it, is they take the last month's business over the net and they multiply it forward by 12. So it's a forward number, but it's a perfect. Now, you can't tell me, much as I love Cisco and it's a wonderful company, that Cisco in the year 1998 is going to represents 1% of electronic commerce in the year 2002. That doesn't make sense. Okay? So that's second data point is that each day $2 trillion circulates around this planet. Now, 1.5 trillion of that tends to be currency movements and currency trading. In the past 6 months, because of Asia, that number is higher than what it would normally be. But still, it's every day $2 trillion moves around the planet. And of course, we know that that money movement does not represent goods and services are a tiny fraction, but you still can't look at electronic commerce and sort of argue that in the year 2000 it's going to be just a few hours of 1998 money movement. That just doesn't make sense. And so these numbers that they're being quoted are just wildly off. And one of the things that happens is they get so wildly off that people, particularly big companies, because little startups don't care, they sort of believe and do things for totally different reasons, but a lot of the big companies are going to miss the boat. And there are going to be many people here, either on the stage or in the audience, who will account for a lot of the commerce that we do as people. Now, consumers will represent somewhere between 10 and 20% of that electronic commerce, but it's still, again, a very interesting phenomenon which gets wildly underestimated. And the fourth number, and the one I'll spend a little bit more time, partly because I have it and partly because it's the one that's the most dear to me these days. And that is a number called teledensity. Now, I don't know how many people know what teledensity is as a measure, but simply put, it's the number of telephone lines per 100 people. Now, Sweden and the United States are at the top of the list at a number that is somewhere between 87 and 90. So you get roughly 87 to 90 telephone lines per 100 people. Now, if you look at other parts of the world, just to give you sort of peg this, you go to Italy. Italy's a little higher than Spain. Italy's at roughly 45. It's still considered highly developed. And you go to Spain, and it might drop down to 40. What's interesting is when you look at other parts of the world, South America, which is a phenomenally interesting part of the world for a number of reasons which make South America in a very, very interesting position. The two reasons are that you have this whole, effectively, continent which speaks two languages, which is very helpful in development, and none of the 100 poorest nations in the world are in South America. These are relatively well-off nations. Now, those nations have a range from, let's say, 12, 13 to, in some cases, maybe 14 as their teledensity, which doesn't sound good, but on the other hand is pretty interesting. In fact, Uruguay is the only country in all of the Americas, including the United States, where the telephone infrastructure is 100% digital. There's not one analog switch in Uruguay. And that is characteristic of a developing nation that doesn't have baggage of history and can start putting in a lot of new infrastructure. So it's a great deal of hope. Problem is when you move to Africa, and you move to Africa and you move to parts of Southeast Asia, but let me focus on Africa. When you get to Africa, the teledensities are in the single-digit numbers. The average, I believe, for Africa is 7. Now, that number is dramatically affected by South Africa, which is pretty high. So if you take South Africa out of the equation, the number drops to about 3 or 4. But even that number is misleading because that number represents really the focus on the urban parts of that part of the world. And if you look at the rural teledensities in Central Africa or in just Africa as a whole, the number drops to 0.01 or 0.008 or something. It really plummets. So when you hear things like 85% of the world has never made a telephone call, don't think that's still true, but it's certainly a number above 50%. So you look at the planet that way, and you look at the teledensities, and then you say, well, wait a minute, Nicholas, you just said there'd be 1 billion people on the net, and you just said there'd be $1 trillion of commerce. That doesn't jive with these teledensities if you add them up. Well, what makes them jive, and this is the part that those of you who were here last year will remember when I talked about 2B1, which was an absolutely new initiative at the time to bring the digital world to children in developing countries. I knew an awful lot less at the time and realized over the past year that if one is going to do that, what you have to do is focus on children in rural parts of the developing world. And by the way, in the developing world, roughly 50% of the population lives in the rural parts. It's not as densely in urban areas as we might think from nations that we know more, that we tend to know better. If you do that, if you focus on those areas, you find out a number of things. And after Dimitri and I showed 2B1 last year and talked about it here, the actual foundation started moving. And as a part of it, what we did is we invited 100 people from around the world to come and spend 5 or 6 days at MIT. I wouldn't call it a conference, but we called it, for the lack of a better word, a gathering. And those 100 people had the following characteristics. First of all, they had to come from a developing nation. They couldn't be bureaucrats or government officials. We didn't want those kind of people. What we wanted were activists. And we found people who, against all odds, had brought the digital world to children. And in one case, one of the people had put a local area network through the favelas outside of Rio. Another person had done the same thing, but in the jungles of Africa. Another person had done it in igloos in sort of the northernmost territories of Canada. It was an extraordinary group of people who gathered. And of course, what they had in common is they, against, as I said, all odds, they had done something by actually doing it, not, again, trying to legislate it, not trying to do it from a bureaucratic point of view, but from an activism point of view. And we learned something extraordinary in this numbers game. And that is that their problem, of course, really is connectivity. That wasn't the surprising part. It's particularly important to remember that in developing countries, the telecommunications is not only crummy, but it is also very expensive, because a lot of the governments are making money off telecommunications. In Greece, which I consider a developing nation and can say, because in some sense I'm Greek, the Greek government fell, literally fell, when they suggested privatization, partly because it was making so much money. And why is it making money? 30% of the income is made from incomplete telephone calls. Okay? That's an extraordinary business. Can you imagine if you made 30% of your profit from defective parts? Okay, and you found that you better not get out of that defective business because you're going to lose a certain amount of income. Well, that we understood, but the part that surprised us, and probably won't you, because I guess when you hear it, is that there was an even bigger problem, and that was power. And 50% of the world really doesn't have power at home, and the production of power is really a big deal. One of the people who came to MIT in July was from India, and what he had done, and the image is really a cute one, he had developed a bicycle that the kids could pedal that would be a generator, and that generator would power the PCs in sort of the next room. So you can see this wonderful scene in a school in some place where half the kids are out there pedaling in the sort of recess area, and the other half are sort of working on their computers, and then they have to switch at the break, and so you have half pedaling and half using it. So it's sort of, it's an aside, but it's an important aside. So let me just sort of sum up, and then if I actually have time left, I'll even answer questions. What we decided to do, what 2B1 is doing in this, again, the numbers game, is to bring the net, bring the digital world to kids in those nations using satellites. Now, there are two flavors of satellites. The one that you know the most about intuitively and from using it either knowingly or unknowingly are the so-called geostationary satellites. Now, I don't want to give a tutorial on satellites, but remember that the rotation speed of a satellite in any orbit has to be a particular velocity so that the centripetal force that would send that satellite into outer space and gravity, which would pull it to the Earth, are equal and opposite. So at any altitude, there's one given velocity. And up there at 22,500 miles, there happens to be a velocity which is exactly equal to the velocity or the rate at which the world spins. So as we turn, that satellite vis-a-vis us looks and feels stationary. Problem is that's so far, so high up, we can use it very easily to broadcast television, but we can't use it quite as easily to send signals up. Now people are doing all sorts of things to make that better. There are companies that are going to be offering within the next 6 months little ground stations, sort of less than 2-foot dishes that will, for $2,500, give you a two-way satellite link. But that's still pretty high, $2,500. And more importantly, at least to us, is that they're going to use somewhere between 100 and 150 watts to do it. So this is, again, a separate problem, but is an important one. But you can service the world in the very near future by using those geostationaries. There's another flavor of satellite you've certainly read about, and that is the ones that are much lower, much closer to the Earth. They're in the 100 to 150 miles away. But because they're so close to Earth, they've got to rotate faster, clearly, because the force of gravity is stronger. And so you have to rotate faster so that the thing doesn't crash or go out to outer space. And I'm sure you've all heard of Teledensity, which is Bill Gates' project, and probably have heard even more about Iridium, which is Motorola's effort. Iridium was designed almost 10, or at least conceived almost 10 years ago, so it has a certain voice bias, and it's not really terrific for data. But what those satellites do, and you launch multiple satellites, so it's like a cellular telephone grid. And right now, when you use your cell phone, you're moving around, and these little points make this grid. Think of these multiple satellites where, so to speak, you're stationary and the grid is rotating around the Earth. Now, what's interesting about them, and it's intuitively very complicated. In fact, there's always a fair amount of designers and visual thinkers and people like what Ricky used to be. And you could probably good at figuring this out. But in the case of Iridium, there are 66 satellites, of which over 40 are already in orbit, that rotate around the Earth. It's a polar orbit. So these 66 satellites go around the Earth in different parts, and there are obviously several of them per slice through the Earth. And as they move, and because they are so much closer to the Earth, you suddenly can take a handheld device and communicate, because it is actually only 150 miles away. Now, what that does is it provides suddenly an infrastructure to the developing nations. Now, people who, like Bill and others, who have started thinking about this more recently will move their satellites into sort of a higher part of the spectrum, going into the gigahertz range, in order to get much broader bandwidth than the current even Ku band satellites. But that means that those satellites can reach any part of the world, clearly. Now, there's a little bit of a problem that these satellites, when they go into darkness, when they come out, they've got to recharge themselves, and so there's all sorts of very complicated geometry here. And just think about it for a second. It's kept me up at night sort of trying to figure these things out, because it's intuitively kind of hard to realize that any part south, and that web, if you will, the spherical envelope of those, is stationary. And so the Earth's rotating inside it. So it's really quite complicated. A satellite that goes over you at one moment is not the satellite, it's not the line of satellites that are going to go over you the next, because the world will have rotated. But if you start using that technology and using it to bring the digital world to people in very remote places, you will again see a lot of those numbers shoot up. And so those are the two things that 2B1 is doing at the moment. So with that, Ricky, how much time do I have? Nothing, maybe.
About a minute, yeah.
I have about a minute. Well, can you ask a question in a minute? No, you take the time back.
Huh? You can have one question.
One question. I do get annoyed that we don't have questions.
We're going to have questions later on, but just
I
not
know.
for you.
Why you didn't tell us about this button box before? You know.
The amount of mail that you read from me is like zip.
It's not that I don't read it. It's that he just sends uppercase only. It's as if the guy, you know. You can have the floor back, sir.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Nicholas.